I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you very much, Mayor Johnson. I think it's clear that if Boris's political career does not work out, he can come to New York and make it as a stand-up comic. So our format's going to be, we're going to have a conversation up here for a few minutes. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator to ask a couple of questions, and we'll then turn it over to Q&A. There are 2 standing mics. We ask that questioners be members of the conference, so Manhattan Institute, Regional Plan Association, or Columbia University students and faculty. So first question is for you, Mayor Bloomberg. You have a house in London, and you're fond of London, and over the years you've made many policy suggestions in New York based on London policies. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think London's greatest competitive advantage is in heading back to the top.
Well, when the part of the world that's expanding most is Europe, London clearly has an advantage. They are, in some senses, more understanding of the world than America is. America is a very big country. Those oceans are very big, although sadly we found out on 9/11 not as big as we thought. But London is, the proximity to the rest of Western Europe is a decided advantage when the business is there, and particularly when the financial business is there. A lot more business will be done in London than in New York. The issue is which firms in London. If they're American firms in London doing the business, then eventually they repatriate their profits back to the United States, and they use their London profits to support their businesses here. When that's not true, when it's Latin America that's the growing part of the world and America's economy is booming, then New York has an advantage. But I've always thought that in order to be a true financial center, 2 things have to be true. English has to be the predominant language, which gives London and New York a distinct advantage, and the city has to be a family-friendly city, which gives both of these cities an advantage, because if you're going to really grow, you have to be able to bring people from around the world. They want to bring their families if they're going to move there. And so the cultural attractions and the parks and the excitement of big cities tend to attract the best and the brightest, and London and New York, and not necessarily in that order, but London and New York will always, I think, be the predominant financial markets. Now, that leads into other things, media, which is more and more in this world an English-speaking business because of the internet and because of people reading newspapers and magazines from around the world. That's an advantage for both of them. Paris certainly is a fashion capital, but London and New York probably have as many. I don't know about London, Boris, but New York has more fashion houses than Paris. London probably does as well. Each of these businesses that require intellectual capital are businesses where London and New York should star. And if one of us catches a cold, you can rest assured the other will as well. Our businesses are indelibly intertwined and go up and down together.
So, Mayor Johnson, what do you think is New York's greatest competitive advantage?
Can you hear me? New York's greatest competitive advantage is simply that it is the unrivaled financial center of a massive single market in North America, and that is something that London, by geography, cannot quite offer, in the sense that we are an island location, and although we are very important and powerful in the European Union, we are not the sole, not representative of the sole government of the European Union, and that's I think, an advantage that that New York has over London. When you come to New York, you know that you've got access to the entire North American market. Thankfully, the City of London does represent infinitely the best starting off place for anybody who wants to export to Europe, anybody who wants to to invest in Europe, and therefore it retains its fantastic lead, which is obviously a matter of such envy on the part of some other European governments, to which I earlier alluded. But I think New York's strength is its dynamism, its energy, the fact that people want to come and live here, and the sheer exuberance of what people think of as the lifestyle in New York. And if I had to, all these things that we've been talking about, all these industries that are going to be the industries of tomorrow, media, you mentioned fashion, Mike, all that kind of stuff. Why do people work in one city or another? It's because they like the life there. And that's why it's so important that you're doing what you're doing with bicycles. And I was interested to see some tables put out in the middle of Times Square in a kind of optimistic kind of Parisian type of way. And that seems to be the right thing to do. You want to improve people's quality of life. If you're going to get the top talent to live in your city, you've got to make it the best big city to live in.
Boris mentioned the proximity of London to Europe. I'll never forget the headline in one of the London newspapers, "Fog covers Channel, Europe isolated."
But that's no longer true, Mike. And let's be absolutely, before this becomes remotely adversarial, this conversation, which we are honoured, proud, paid up, fully supportive members of the European Union. And when you are
using sterling,
when you are in, if you wish to have access to those growing markets and those absolutely essential markets, then London is by far your best base from which to do it. And if you fail to use the opportunity to go to London, then really there is no other venue in the European Union which will offer quite the same attractions, in my view.
So, Mayor Bloomberg, let's go the other way. What is, in your view, London's greatest, most serious competitive disadvantage?
Well, I think that they are going to have some problems of being more accommodative. All of Europe has the same problem, more accommodative to immigrants. Sadly, America has exactly the same problem outside of New York. The future of any big city is the free flow of labor as well as capital. And in New York City, we need more immigrants from all parts of the world. Those are the people who are going to start our businesses and take the jobs nobody else will, and view the glass as half full. As I was with somebody who from Nigeria, and I said, "Are you married?" "Yes." His wife works in a store, and he works for the city. I said, "Do you have kids?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I have a daughter at Harvard Medical School and a son at Yale, and my youngest son is graduating public high school and going to Swarthmore this year." And I said, "How do you afford it?" And he said, "Oh, Mayor Bloomberg, you don't understand. This is the most wonderful city in the world. My wife and I can each have 2 jobs." And it's that attitude of anything's possible. And I think that New York has that more than London, and that Boris is the kind of person to convince the Brits that they should open up more, and that the future is of going back and forth more.
Okay.
Well, I think Mike's, London is full of. Mike's obviously a shining example of the ability to have more than one job, and it's a very, very important thing to be able to do. And I want you to know that I believe in a bit of multitasking myself, and I think it's very, very important and a vital part of the flexibility of an economy. And I'd have to concede that on that, I think, Mike, you are right. I do worry, particularly now as we look at the fiscal problems we're in. I do worry that there are some social rigidities, there are some employment rigidities in London, which you'll all be familiar with, partly generated by the European Union, partly homegrown, which at the margin can make it a little bit more difficult to fire people. And that is something that I think that is a distinction between the New York and the American economy and our own. Obviously, there are social advantages too to the way that we do things in the UK. And I suppose, I don't know what your question was, Julia. What was your question?
My question is...
You didn't ask me a question. I
No,
just gave you an answer.
That's right. What is, in your view, what is New York's greatest, most serious competitive disadvantage in getting back
I was
to the
hoping you were
top?
going to say that. Okay, I was hoping you were going to say, look, I think, funnily enough, I think New York's single biggest competitive disadvantage is something that actually is now a diminishing problem. And that was a perception that was very much alive a few years ago, that this was an unsafe city. And I think if you look at the achievements of the mayor and indeed his predecessors, and this is my impression, and you're going to have to take this as the impressions of an uneducated outsider coming to look at of a hick coming to look at your city. It is my impression that it is now considerably safer than it was. Is that right?
Oh,
there's a bit of nodding
yes.
going on.
Considerably
I think the
so.
mayor's nodding. There's a lot of nodding going on. I think that is very, very important for New York. I mean, obviously, I would point out, I can't conceal the fact from you that your murder rate is still about 3 times higher than that of London. But you're doing well. And
I don't think our murder rate is 3 times higher than London.
Actually, sadly, Julia, because of guns, the most safest cities like New York, which once again the FBI the other day put out some numbers, we are the safest big city. Out of 260 cities in America of 100,000 or more, there's only 14 cities out of 260 that are safer than New York on a per capita basis. But nevertheless, it is true, you compare to Europe where they don't have more guns than people on the streets, their murder rate is still dramatically lower.
Well, thank you, Boris. Yes.
I'm afraid the mayor a raison. He is right.
Which is why we've got to keep fighting this battle with Washington against the NRA and get guns off the streets if you want to be safer.
So let's move to Q&A with the audience. There are the 2 standing mics. And
Steve Savis, City University of New York. Mayor Johnson, I understand that that London has a privatized bus system which is working exceedingly well. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how in fact it is working and how you got there?
What we have in London is a massively successful bus system that delivers about 2 billion journeys a year. It is hugely popular. It's increased exponentially, or very, very fast, over the last 10 years or so, basically by very, very cheap subsidized fares. The average fare in London for a journey is 49p. I don't know what that would be I don't know how that compares with New York, but it is, they're very, very popular means of transport. The buses are much, much cleaner, more efficient, they're safer. Bus crime is now down a great deal this year on last year, because we flooded the buses with so many uniformed people that sometimes it became hard for some people to get on the buses. There were so many people supervising, and that's a great thing. It has made the buses safer. They're very, very popular, and we run a complicated system with the contractors, with the franchisees, by which we pay them basically a gross cost arrangement to run the service, and they agree the routes, and it works very well.
Interestingly, we've had exactly the reverse experience. We had about 7 different bus companies providing service in some of the outer boroughs, and it was just the complaints were there every day. We finally took them over with an enormous amount of political capital being spent to get the unions to agree and the state legislature to agree and the city legislature to agree. And since then, a measure of success is I haven't heard anybody complain about that. It has been successful. So we've looked at trying to privatize some things. In some cases, it's not the direction that I think we should go in. We've been going in the other direction, and nobody's a bigger capitalist than I am. I've looked, for example, at our sanitation department, trying to measure whether the private sector picks up garbage more efficiently than the public sector. Both pick up about 11,000 tons a day. And when you adjust a little bit for the fact the sanitation department has to clean the streets and plow the streets and that sort of thing, it looks like they both cost about the same thing to do. The private sector in this city, for those that don't know, picks up all the commercial waste, and the public sector picks up all the residential waste.
Yes.
Hi. Russell with Picture the Homeless, and I think a lot of your wit goes over our head, Boris. I hope you were kidding about building housing on brownfields. I wasn't sure. But I have a question for Mr. Bloomberg. You promised to build 400,000 affordable units by 2013. You haven't been able to build the 50,000 that you promised in your first 8 years.
I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
You promised to build 400,000 affordable units by 2013, I believe you said.
No, we promised to build 165,000 affordable units by the year 2013. We are ahead of schedule. Now, in all fairness, we did stretch it out 1 year because of the economic crisis, but we are ahead of schedule doing that. And that 165,000 units will house roughly 500,000 people, which is more than the number of people that live in Atlanta. The 400,000 number that I used in my speech is saving or creating 400,000 jobs, and it's hard to measure because when you save, how do you know whether you really saved the job or not? But we have a bunch of programs to try to address the problem that some people are losing their jobs, some companies want to move out, some companies downsize, and we shouldn't just say, well, that's the way it is. We've got to try programs to fix it. The 165,000 number you'll be able to measure very clearly. There's a physical apartment right there. The 400,000 jobs, in all fairness, are estimates by economists of what would have happened had you not done something, and the results of some programs that are just difficult to measure.
Well, thanks for clarifying that, but that's not my question. And I would remind you, when you said 95,000 people lost their jobs, those are families too, and those include probably 200,000 or 300,000 people. But my question is really about the vacant buildings and vacant lots in the city of New York, and why, since your housing plan has not worked in the last 2 terms, you cannot sit down with a group like ours, Picture the Homeless, who are composed of homeless people, and work out a plan with you. Can I just finish, Mr. Mayor?
Fine.
You've claimed that you're going to build affordable units for single people making $92,000 a year, and I'm sure a lot of people here think that's not too much money, but really in the real world that's not affordable. And I was hoping that you would, in your census and AMI calculations where you build a certain amount of housing, calculate the income for homeless people, which is basically not on the books and off the record, and think about sitting down with our group, Picture the Homeless, to work out a plan with you. So I just want to ask you why you will not survey the vacant land and vacant houses. I see in the back of the booklet there's a thing about vacant land is going down, the price is going up. Now's the time to make a critical move. Can I just finish and use this vacant land?
We don't
have
time.
You plan to do it?
Got your
Thank
question.
you very
I'd be
much.
happy to answer it. You're welcome. The fact of the matter is, if you go back 2 decades, maybe Ed Koch's administration, the city had taken over an enormous number of houses because people didn't pay their taxes. There was vacant land, and the city's inventory of real estate was really quite substantial. Over the last 2 decades, and particularly over the last 6 or 7 years, all of that has been sold off. All of it has been bought by developers. And in the aggregate, the number of building plots in our city is much too small if we want to grow. So one of the things that's most important is Amanda Burden and the city's planning commission rezonings that we can find space, create space, whether it's building one on top of another, whether it's using space better, to build the housing that we need, build the industrial space we need, at the same time keeping the character of communities, because people live in one area and they'd like it to stay the same. It's never going to stay the same. It is going to evolve, but you want an evolutionary change rather than a revolutionary change. Julia?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, but you lie.
That was said before. I heard that.
Thomas Grisey. I'm a judge in the United States District Court, and for Mayor Johnson, a writer that I know and respect David Price Jones was talking recently about the English legal system, and he said that in his view there's a growing problem because of three possible legal systems that might be applicable. British law, of course, European law, and what he said was being permitted is the application of Sharia law in communities where they're largely or wholly Muslims. And could you comment on that?
Well, thank you. I mean, there are two very distinct issues there. Well, obviously they're philosophically related, but politically, the question of the supremacy of European law is one that's been, I'm afraid, long acknowledged. It's there in the documents of accession to the treaty, to the European community or union as it is now, and it's simply a fact of our jurisdiction. There are matters in which the community, the union, has competence, and when the European Court of Justice is asked to arbitrate on those matters, then the judgments of that court will, I'm afraid, take priority over UK common law, UK judge-made law. And that is obviously something that is, in my view, difficult. It is very politically contentious in our country. It is something, in my view, that argues very strongly for a legislative restraint on the part of the European Union. And I would like to see far fewer directives, not least this hedge fund directive, which they can get rid of if they like, but I think there should be far fewer regulations coming forward from the European Union, because it is they that eat away and superimpose upon the domestic system of law. On the issue of Sharia and the potential conflict with domestic law, that is something where I think fears are, in my view, overdone. Certainly in our country, though I'm interested to hear other experiences. If it is possible that through local arrangements or discussions or whatever it happens to be, people can avoid going to court and avoid the expense and nightmare of getting wrapped up in the legal system, then I'm not convinced that a discussion of Sharia court or whatever, Sharia argument of that kind might be wholly inappropriate. What you cannot have is a Sharia system that is viewed as in some way superior or supervening upon local laws. That is simply intolerable, and that is not something that I'm aware of in London, and not something that we would allow.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good morning. Daniel Bowman-Simon, Columbia University. I'm greatly encouraged by both cities' sustainability efforts. I biked here this morning safely in my suit, but I am concerned about our city's abilities to feed ourselves in times of crisis. Mayor Johnson, the Queen has now restored her gardening allotment. Mayor Bloomberg, I believe you were at the White House meeting with President Obama the day Michelle Obama planted her vegetable garden. On their coattails, and in light of climate change, economic uncertainty, and startling health concerns, how can and should great cities encourage many more people to get back to the land and grow their own food for jobs, education, and healthful recreation?
Well, our environmental efforts really have been focused on reducing our greenhouse emissions, reducing our energy dependence, and that sort of thing. There really isn't the land. There are some plots where people have vegetable gardens and that sort of thing, but basically New York's density, and I think London's too, really doesn't permit that. I do think that a sensible agricultural policy for this country... No. You have, I'm sure you have lots of gardens in London.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but if you, Mike, but the plain fact is, I think the speaker is absolutely right. I think if you think that we can supply our city's food needs by growing on roofs and in our own back gardens and on railway sidings and all the rest of that, I think that is, I'm afraid, delusional. We can't do that. But what we can do is encourage the use of many more growing spaces and find undiscovered growing spaces across London. We have a big project to open up bits of land much of it in our transport network that is not used, and where young people who have time on their hands, who need to build up teamwork and all the things that they may be lacking in their lives can come. And we have a massive allotment program run by Rosie Boycott, who's probably not yet big this side of the Atlantic. She's huge in London. She's the chair of the London Food Board. And, if you ask me how many allotments we're going to have by 2012, the answer is a lot. And, in fact, we have a plan to have more than, I think she's already got 2,000 growing spaces, new growing spaces, and we're finding them on roofs. You've got plenty of roofs in New York. It seems to me you've got bags of space, and it is something that is therapeutic, it is green, and in tackling climate change, it helps to make the city more absorptive of heat and indeed of the very heavy downpours that some meteorologists predict.
My foundation, we're putting a green roof on the building. I will talk to them about corn and rhubarb in particular.
Yes.
Hi, Catherine Alden. I'm from California, but associated with the Manhattan Institute. And I was talking to Mayor Johnson about biking and being very thankful to Mayor Bloomberg for the new bike paths and trails. But also, the roads here are not in the best shape. And I think if you took a look, unfortunately, the cost of bearing the brunt of these roads is different from who it would cost to improve them. Is there any way to connect these dots? Because I would think it would be a net benefit if you take the city as a whole, the people driving the cars, the trucks, the buses, and the cities. Is there any way to?
Well, the future is mass transit, or you don't have a future. I think that the more successful we are, the more you're going to clog your roadways. And so we have to find ways to have mass transit. You have to have the MTA providing a lot more, and you have to have disincentives for people to drive and incentives for people to take mass transit. That's one of the problems of our roads. The use of them is greater than in most other cities. I'm not sure London really does have as much traffic probably as we do. The other problem that we have that London doesn't as much is the changing in seasons. And there's nothing that damages your roads more than the day we have to plow. Those plows remove the snow. They also dig up the streets. And you have to plow the streets. And so the real cost that people always talk about, we calculated one time $1 million an inch is what it costs you for snow. Now that's over a long, long period of time, and you really only plow in big snowstorms. But nevertheless, a cost that would dwarf that is the repairs to the roads that come about from the constant freezing and unfreezing of water that gets under the asphalt, and also the damage the plows do. And in the end, using the roads less by having mass transit, which is why the MTA does a spectacular job with the subway line that I take. It doesn't do a good job in providing subway service to other places that don't have it. And that's what we've got to do if we're going to ever make your roads better.
Thank you.
Bo Everett, NYU Langone Medical Center. I'm curious to hear you speak about the relative role of healthcare in the economies of these two cities and in light of the current debate in Washington.
My experience, Boris, is that in London, all of Western Europe, you spend less per capita on healthcare than we do, and you have a life expectancy greater than ours. And the first question that I think Congress and the President should be asking is, why is that true? We are spending an enormous amount of money. Everybody agrees we have to get costs under control, but the first question is, what are we getting for our money? And I don't hear that dialogue in Washington at all. I don't think you can fix healthcare unless you fix immigration and fix tort reform and a variety of other things. But the one thing that seems to be off limits in the discussion is, are we spending our money intelligently? Are the right people doing the right things? And unless you do that, you're going to constantly have this money pit that you throw things down. And I think in Europe, I think in London as well, you guys do a much better job than we do.
Mayor Bloomberg, would you just lay out briefly the size of the health sector in New York and how important it is to New York's
Well,
economy?
we're a medical center. We have 11 public hospitals. We have a bunch of teaching hospitals, private hospitals, voluntaries. We have a bioscience industry that is growing, although what seems to happen, and we're trying to fight it, is drugs are created here and then manufactured over in New Jersey. And so we're trying to solve that problem and have incubators so drug companies will have more people here in the city rather than taking them out to the suburbs. But people come here for medical care from around the country. Doctors come here to be trained. Sadly, what we do is we train the best and the brightest and then don't give them green cards. And it is creating a shortage of doctors in upstate New York and middle America. And that's one of the big issues that nobody seems to face when they talk about giving health care to coverage, insurance to more people. I'm very much in favor of that, but you have to at the same time address the problem of who is going to provide the care. And I never hear that debate at all. And that's my immigration as one of the one of the things you have to fix before you will solve your health care problem. Tort reform is another one of them.
I would say, obviously, I don't want to intrude too much into the debate going on in this country. I would say that, we have a fantastic healthcare system in London. It's a wonderful system, the National Health Service. It's an object of great admiration by the huge majority of the British people. But, you shouldn't run away with the idea that it is completely perfect. There are huge health inequalities in London that we have to deal with, and they're part of my brief. And, of course...
Is it a significant job creator and component of
yeah, I mean, I think it is, it used to be a commonly quoted statistic that, the National Health Service was the single biggest public employer on the European landmass, apart from the Red Army. With the demise of the Red Army, that is obviously no longer true. It is a very big generator of employment. It's a wonderful institution. The sad thing is that we face a real period of fiscal retrenchment now, and we're going to have to take a role in London in making sure that the axe, doesn't fall too heavily on services in London, which need to be protected, and we need to have a proper strategic view of what is done. All I will say about your own healthcare system, I'm a proud beneficiary of it. Well, because what I didn't tell you earlier on, folks, is that not only was I born in New York, but I was born on something called the Puerto Rican Health Scheme, because my parents were so impoverished at the time. I don't know what the Puerto Rican Health Scheme is. I don't know where you're looking completely blank. It obviously doesn't exist anymore, but it was obviously some scheme for the benefit of impoverished British students in New York, and I'm proud and grateful to the people of New York for clubbing together in the way that they did to allow me to be brought into the world.
For the benefit of our Fourth Estate, scheme is a word that means something different in British than in American. It does not have the bad connotation that it does in America.
Yes.
What connotation does it have in America?
It's something nefarious, whereas we would use the word plan maybe rather than scheme in Britain.
Well, whatever it was, I didn't think there was anything nefarious about
well, I mean, you turned out okay.
Yeah.
Must have worked. I don't know
quite what you're driving at here, Mike. Anyway, perhaps in the oral tradition of my family, the exact nomenclature of this program has been confused. Perhaps it wasn't a scheme, perhaps it was a plan. But whatever plan it was, I'm thoroughly grateful for it.
There you go.
And I have a feeling that it was financed by the people of New York, or the taxpayers of this city, rather than by my parents. So thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Bruno Orsini from the business school. I'm a student here. Tina O'Reilly, the internet specialist, recently wrote an article where
we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Tina O'Reilly, the internet specialist, recently wrote an article in which he compares citizens' expectancy of governments to vending machines. We restrict our participation often in putting money in and screaming for the services to get out. Do you think that a way for London and New York in the future to stay in the top might be a shift towards working more as a platform for citizens to take on increasingly take on roles that were traditionally done by the governments more efficiently?
Well, I mean, you know, I'm afraid it's you know, a function of what I just said, that in an environment where our country, thanks to a long period of profligacy, is facing retrenchment, there will obviously be some services, I can imagine, that will be under real pressure, and there will be cuts, and there will be things that people will be asked to do themselves. And, you know, whatever your views on that matter, I'm afraid it is simply going to happen. Actually, it's in those circumstances that I think we should be looking very hard at what's happening with the banks and the people in, you know, who are doing very, very well again, buoyed up with all this taxpayers' money. If we are going to see cuts in services, if we are going to see people being asked to rely on their own resources, I want to see a much greater sense of community and giving from those members of the financial services industry.
Henry?
Henry Stern, New York Civic. This is my question. The city and the state and the federal government all seem to be undergoing, they are, severe financial crises in that the amount of money raised by taxes, revenues, is short of the amount of money that's being spent. Now, the federal government can print money, but the city and state can't. I know the city has done much better than the state in the last 6 years as far as trimming expenditures and preventing growth. But the state is really in a hole, as California is, because of political pressures to spend. Now, what can be done? Is this a chronic, lifetime condition? What do you do when the public demand for services exceeds their willingness to pay for them?
Well, in the end, you have to stop providing those services. Unlike, as you point out, unlike the federal government, we can't print money. And there will be a point where you saw in California, they actually ran out of cash and they started paying their bills with IOUs. I don't know that New York State's problems are quite that great yet, but you are going to see an enormously difficult and cantankerous battle in Albany. First, to balance the current budget, which they've just discovered they have a $2+ billion deficit, but also next year's budget, which they have to put in place legally by the end of March. I don't know how big their deficit's going to be, but our estimates for the city are that next year our tax revenues will be $5 billion less than last year, and we have a requirement that we balance the budget on a accrual basis at the end of the year. Now, the state's requirements aren't quite so stringent. They have to pass a balanced budget, and so they have more room to define the problem away a little bit. But in the end, the marketplace is going to have to decide whether or not they're defining the problem away or facing the problem, and they're going to have to go through make some very difficult decisions. I am particularly worried about it because they're going into an election year, and that tends not to be a period when you have the best fiscal policy. And the effect that the state has on New York City is dramatic. If the state were to raise taxes, it's the New York City residents that pay a disproportionate share of those. If the state decides to cut back monies that they send back to municipalities, it is relatively easy for them to hurt New York disproportionately because politically there's less at stake when you have one party that predominates. And also, it's a handful of counties rather than lots of counties, even though the numbers are exactly the reverse. So we're going to have some very tough times ourselves without the state. We're going to have this budget in balance, and that's just the way it is. You can't have your cake and eat it too. But the thing that really should worry city residents is how the state solves its problems. And hopefully it won't be as bad as California, and you read about Illinois and Massachusetts. But I think that's a very serious thing that you're right to point out and we should worry about.
Thank you.
Hi, John Petro from the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy. As you were saying, the unemployment in the city hasn't been as bad as we originally anticipated it would be, but for certain communities it's been very bad. We're talking about communities of color. And I would like to hear from Mayor Johnson if London has had any economic development strategies that are aimed at inclusion and bringing up the welfare of traditionally excluded, populations, and whether or not you see any ideas that we could use here in New York.
I'm sorry, so what was the last bit of your question?
If you have any strategies for economic inclusion and anything that you think that we could use here in New York.
Yeah, we have a huge range of programs which are designed to help people from all communities, and the London Development Agency has been historically working very, very hard to target groups who find it difficult to get businesses off the ground, to help black women or whatever it happens to be, to try to get people into employment in a particularly a vigorous and targeted way. Some of these programs, to be absolutely clear, have been less successful than others. And we've got to be honest about that, and the London Development Agency, it'd be fair to say, went through a pretty rocky period over the last few years, because a lot of what was being done, although possibly with the best possible intentions, didn't seem to be delivering value for the taxpayer, and or indeed for the people whose interests were being targeted. So we've had to do a bit of reform and retrenchment there, but I certainly believe that you've got to make sure that in a recession of the kind that we're in, you have to help the people who are most likely to suffer, and those people will tend to be the people that you identified.
Well, I was particularly interested in what you were talking about, the manufacturing of bicycles and the confectionery. Were there any policies that you put in place to advance manufacturing in London?
Advanced manufacturing, among particular groups, well, we have a wide range of policies to support manufacturing. I'd have to get back to you with chapter and verse about whether we target particular groups to support them in their projects. I'm not certain that, I see Judith shaking her head there, I'm not certain that that is something that we would necessarily do just for fear of not maximizing taxpayer value and the utility of the very limited sums that we have to spend. We think there are lots of ways that you can help people.
We're trying to help small businesses and target groups that are traditionally underemployed. But in the end, the answer to your question is education. Because the way the world is going, the haves and the have-nots will be probably more defined by how much education and the quality of the education they receive. So long-term, the most important thing that we are doing in this city is improving the public school system for traditionally underserved groups and for those that have been served. We've got to raise the bar. We've got to make sure it's more inclusive. It doesn't solve your problem short-term, but long-term it does, and it's improving the public schools, it's improving the community colleges, which tend to be vocational training for the high school graduates that don't want to go to a four-year college. Having said all of that, the short-term responses are called 311, and you'll get small business services. We place 20,000 odd people that we've trained. We have programs to help small businesses throughout the cities. We're trying to encourage minority and women-owned businesses and make it easier for them to do business with the city. And London probably does the same kinds of things. The other problem you see is traditionally first in, first out. Or last in, first out, I'm sorry. And that, unfortunately, those groups who had started to catch up are probably bearing a little bit more of the pressure of a downsizing. So getting the whole economy going, having things like tourism, which create jobs throughout the city at all economic levels. I mean, the Olympics, for example, my congratulations to London, but if we had built that stadium, if we had gotten the Olympics, we'd be in better shape today in terms of creating jobs in construction and all of the tourism-related industries than we are. And we tried and we didn't win, and okay, I mean, hopefully Chicago will win the next time. and that will help Chicago, but it'll also help America. So I mean, there's a short and long-term answer to your question.
And just things you can do to target specific groups, we do have cut-price travel for people on income support or who are looking for jobs. I mean, we greatly reduce the cost of travel, and we have a very toughly enforced London living wage, which we insist upon for everybody who's employed by the GLA bodies, and that's very, very important. And we're trying to push that out across London so that people understand the benefits of doing that. And Barclays Bank, for instance, you might not thought of being the obvious customers for something like a London living wage, have agreed to do it, and that is because they see the merits of it for their employees. It saves, obviously, on, it creates loyalty, and it saves on their employment costs, they find. And so we're very, very confident in pushing that policy forward.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Vikash Reddy. I'm a student at Columbia University's Teachers College. And Mayor Johnson, you and I were able to take advantage of the educational benefits of what I would call the best high school in the world. But before coming to Columbia, I taught public school, an American definition of public school, in East New York, which is a neighborhood that Mayor Bloomberg might be able to tell you a little more about. And it's very clear to anybody who's ever been in a public school in East New York that the opportunities afforded at our public schools in these neighborhoods are very, very different from the opportunities afforded by Eton College. And so I'm wondering what you're doing in London. I know a little more about what Mayor Bloomberg has done here in New York, but what you're doing in London and what ideas our two cities can share to make sure that every student, independent of race, of ethnicity, of simple birth status, what every student, to afford them the opportunities afforded by Eton College.
What we have in the UK is, in my view, a tragic system of educational apartheid, if you like, between two systems, and there are far too many rigidities and difficulties in the state system, in the maintained sector, and I would like to see much more flexibility for people who want to set up new schools. I believe you have a system of charter schools here in New York. I'd like to see some real changes to the law in the UK. It's the 1944 Education Act, which basically gave the state the role of monopoly supplier of all state-funded education. A monopoly supplier of all state-funded education. And in my view, that is the problem, because it is not possible for independent actors to set up agencies to set up and become independent suppliers of state-funded education. And that, in my view, is the core of the problem. So you don't have the proper elements of competition and choice and excitement and all the things that I think you could generate in our system. And I would like to see that in London. I mean, there are all sorts of other arguments as well about, whether you should allow academic selection and that kind of thing, admission by academic achievement. And I'm personally not philosophically opposed to that at all. But I do think that what you need to sort out first is the huge, massive rigidity in our system that stops new entrants from coming in, stops parents from getting together and starting schools if they want to. That's what you want to see in London. And I'm very interested in some of the things that are going on in this country.
I'm afraid we have to wrap this up, so we have no more time for questions. I'd like to thank our two mayors. And,
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, it's very good to see you. Thank you. President Bollinger is going to join.
President Bollinger? Right. Fantastic. Okay.
So I'm here to thank the distinguished guests, London Mayor Boris Johnson and New York's Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and to thank you for this lively discussion on behalf of all of us. As many of you know, Mayor Johnson was born in New York. The United States and Britain are the closest of allies and have a long tradition of cooperation and trade. We gave them Boris Johnson, and they gave us David Beckham and Posh Spice, who in honor of their love for this city named their son Brooklyn. So welcome home, Mr. Mayor. I understand that you said earlier that you had come to Columbia as an infant in arms. If we had only had early admission at that point, you would be a graduate of Columbia at this point. Mayor Bloomberg is no stranger to Columbia University, of course, or to our shared belief in the indispensable role of cities in the global economy. He has partnered with us on a number of important initiatives related to improving the health of this city's economy and its people. He understands that research, universities like Columbia, are integral to the life of this and other major cities around the world. He's been to the campus many times. His most recent visit here came last June when the city's Global Partners Office, under the direction of Commissioner Marjorie Tiven, joined us to sponsor a World Leaders Summit on workforce development and the urban economy. I am also proud to serve as the university representative on, one of the university representatives on the mayor's recently formed task force to ensure the future growth of New York's media industry. So welcome back to Columbia, Mr. Mayor. I also want to thank the organizers of this event, Lawrence Mohn and Julia Vitula Martin of the Manhattan Institute, Sir Alan Collins, Her Majesty's Consul General in New York, and our own Esther Fuchs, Professor of Public Affairs and Political Science, who has chosen this discussion between the mayors of London and New York to kick off this year's Global Mayors Forum. This is also the first of our World Leaders Forum and underscores our belief that universities in cities like New York and London have an obligation to engage our students in solving problems like the world economic crisis and climate change. These are two major global cities searching for solutions to these and other problems. And let me close by just emphasizing that I think we all understand that you cannot have great cities without having great universities within those cities. And as we think about the expansion of Columbia and a new campus over the next half-century into Harlem, which Mayor Bloomberg was critical in helping us to achieve, if you think of what that can do and will do for the collaboration across these two great cities and beyond on issues of the day, it's extremely important. Mind-Brain Behavior Institute will bring neuroscience, with a very strong connection between neuroscience in London and neuroscience here. The School of the Arts, there's no area of human endeavor that is more international already, more global than the arts, and again, strong connections between these two cities. The School of International and Public Affairs will go to Manhattanville. And there we have a new MPA program between SEPA and the London School of Economics and other collaborations. And finally, the Business School, which also has deep connections with London Business School and London as a city. So we're proud to host this event here, and I want to thank all of you for coming and for the two mayors, whom I'm sure have enlightened everyone in this room this morning. Thank you very much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.